Hello everyone, I'm Sebastian Y and this is Foundations of Economics. In this video I'm going to talk about unemployment, how it's measured, and why it exists. In the United States, unemployment data is collected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. All employment data in the United States is based on the civilian non-institutional population. This is defined as people aged 16 and older who are neither inmates of institutions or active duty military. The idea behind this is to give us a sense for the number of people who could be employed outside the military. Within that population, the BLS categorizes people into three groups: employed, people who have a job; unemployed, that's people who do not have a job but are looking for one; and then finally people who are not in the labor force. People who are not in the labor force do not have a job and are not looking for one. So this would be people who are full-time students, retirees, discouraged workers. Discouraged workers are people who were unemployed and looking for a job, but have given up looking for a job. This means that those who are employed and unemployed together make up the labor force. We can use these categories to calculate two important statistics. The first is the labor force participation rate. This is the percentage of people in the civilian non-institutional population who choose to be in the labor force. To calculate this, we take the labor force, that's the unemployed and employed together, and divide that by the full population. We then multiply that by 100%. Let's go over to Excel and calculate this. In this Excel file, I have monthly data from 1948 on for three variables: the civilian non-institutional population, the labor force, and number of employed. All three of these variables are in thousands of people. For example, the civilian non-institutional population in January of 1948 was about 102 million. The labor force was 60 million, and of those, 58 million were employed. First thing I'm going to do is calculate the labor force participation rate. As we defined it before, we're going to take our total labor force and divide that by the total population. Then we're going to multiply it by 100%. So for January 1948, the labor force participation rate was about 58.6%. I'm going to copy this all the way down. As we scroll through this data, we can see the participation rate hovers around 58 to 59% for many years. In the 1970s, we can see it start to tick up into the low 60s. Through the 80s, we get up into the mid 60% range. Once we get into the 90s, the participation rate is holding steady at about 66%, goes up to 67%, and then starts to drop off after the turn of the millennium. And it slowly has been decreasing since then. The most recent figure we have is September of 2020, where the labor force participation rate was 61%. Slightly higher than where it was in 1948, but relatively similar. The next figure we're going to calculate is the unemployment rate. For this, we take the unemployed and divide by the labor force and multiply by 100%. Remember that unemployed only counts people who do not have a job but are looking for one. And we divide that by the labor force, which is the total amount of people who either have a job or want a job. The unemployment rate does not count people who are not in the labor force. Back over here in Excel, we're going to calculate the unemployment rate. But first, let's actually calculate the number of unemployed. Remember that The labor force is the total of the employed and unemployed population. And so to figure out unemployed based on what we have, we can take the total labor force and subtract the number of employed people. And so we can see that in January of 1948, there were about 2 million unemployed. Now we can calculate the unemployment rate. To do that, we are going to take the total unemployed, divide by the labor force, and multiply by 100%. We'll copy that all the way down. So, for example, in January 1948, the unemployment rate was about 3.4%. Let's go all the way down to the bottom and look at what the unemployment rate looks at our most recent figure, which is September of 2020, where it is about 7.8%. We can see over the last few months, unemployment has reached record levels since 1948, and this is all due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's take a quick look at a graph of the unemployment figures that we just looked at in Excel. We can see that there is somewhat of a cyclical nature to unemployment. At certain times, it spikes up and then comes back down. High unemployment usually follows on the heels of recessions. For example, we can see quite a dramatic increase in unemployment right here from about 2008 to 2010. This, of course, is the Great Recession, which we've talked about a little bit earlier in this course. And then, of course, we can see the huge increase in unemployment that happens right here in April 2020, which is when the COVID-19 pandemic started to get really bad in the United States. Cyclical unemployment is unemployment that fluctuates due to what we call the business cycle. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. For the reasons I'll discuss later in the video, there's always going to be some unemployment in an economy. And that's what we call the natural rate of unemployment. Fluctuations around that natural rate are called cyclical unemployment. As I mentioned before, there's always going to be some unemployment in any economy. And we're going to talk about a few reasons why that is. There are two broad categories of causes of unemployment. The first is called frictional unemployment. We've talked about lots of different markets for goods and services. In those markets, as long as they're competitive, the price adjusts to equilibrium, where we get a price where the quantity demanded is exactly equal to the quantity supplied, and there's no excess demand, no excess supply. Everybody who wants to sell can sell, everybody who wants to buy can buy. When we talked about those markets, we were making an implicit assumption that there are no frictions in the market, meaning there's no cost for a buyer to find a seller and no cost for a seller to find a buyer. In markets for goods and services, there may be some small frictions in real life, but the labor market in particular has a lot of friction. It takes time for a firm to find the right employee, and it takes time for a worker to find the right employer. This process is known as job search. If the labor market were also frictionless, we could find an equilibrium wage with an exactly matching quantity of labor supplied and demanded, and there wouldn't be any unemployment. But in reality, the labor market does have friction. The process of matching workers to employees is not free. In particular, it takes time for a firm to find the right employee, and it takes time for a worker to find the right employer. Typically, each individual person doesn't spend that much time unemployed while they're searching for a job, but somebody is always searching for a job. And so the economy as a whole always has some frictional unemployment. It is inevitable. The other reasons for unemployment we will talk about are forms of structural unemployment. These are causes for unemployment unrelated to job search. Structural unemployment occurs because there are insufficient jobs available to provide work to all who want one in a particular labor market. One form of structural unemployment comes from minimum wage laws. Economists do debate how important minimum wages are in causing unemployment, and there's been some mixed evidence on that. As you may recall back from when we discussed price floors and price ceilings, a minimum wage is a price floor. It sets a wage that the equilibrium wage is not allowed to go below. While the minimum wage applies to all labor markets, it's only binding in some. For labor markets where the equilibrium wage is above the minimum wage, it doesn't have any effect. It's non-binding. But in some markets, particularly lower skilled labor markets, the minimum wage can be binding. And if it is binding, it's going to cause some unemployment. Let's return to our example from the previous video where we had a labor demand function of 112 minus 4W and a labor supply function negative 32 plus 8W. In the previous video, we did the algebra on this and figured out the equilibrium wage would be 12. And the equilibrium quantity of labor we found was 64. Suppose that the minimum wage is 16. Since this is above our equilibrium wage, it's going to be binding. The amount of labor demanded will be 112 minus 4 times 16, which is 48. Notice that's lower than the equilibrium. And labor supplied will be negative 32 plus 8 times 16, which is 96. A general result of a binding minimum wage is it will lower the amount of labor demanded because it's now more expensive to hire, but it will increase the amount of labor supplied because it will encourage more people to join the labor force. The amount of unemployment is going to be the difference in these two. LS minus LD, or 96 minus 48, which is going to be 48. This is the amount of labor that would be supplied but no one wants to hire. Let's sketch a quick graph of this. If we draw in our equilibrium wage right here, and then draw in a horizontal line for our minimum wage, we have our quantity of labor demanded right here. We have our quantity of labor supplied right here, and the difference will be a surplus of labor, which it will be our unemployment. Anytime wage is above the equilibrium, we're going to get some unemployment. The minimum wage is one reason why that happens, but it's not the only reason. Another reason why wages might be above the equilibrium is what we call efficiency wages. Efficiency wages happen when a firm pays a wage above the equilibrium of their own accord, not related to the minimum wage, because they think that it will increase productivity. There are a few reasons why this might happen. The first is nutrition. As we discussed in the videos on productivity, nutrition is an important part of human capital and therefore productivity. Malnourished workers are simply not as effective in performing their jobs. And in some cases, especially in poor countries, it could make a lot of sense for a firm to pay their workers higher wages to ensure that they get proper nutrition and can perform their jobs adequately. The second reason is for reduced turnover. We've already talked about the fact that replacing a worker involves a job search that takes time and resources, and if a firm pays their workers better, then workers are less likely to quit and look for a different job. One last reason for efficiency wages could be because higher wages attract better job candidates. Higher quality job candidates know their worth and might not even apply for jobs if the wages are too low. By paying higher wages, a firm might get those better job candidates to apply for their jobs. Regardless of the reason, firms paying efficiency wages above the equilibrium will result in a surplus of labor or unemployment. More people will want jobs than there are available. This has been a quick introduction to the labor market and unemployment and a few reasons why unemployment happens. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Thanks for watching.